Hi everyone, in this presentation we'll try and understand a very important theory that explains language learning with reference to the mind. This theory seeks to explain what happens in the mind when we learn a second language. But before we start looking at the explanation, let's differentiate between two important terms, learning and acquisition. Learning refers to a conscious process where we put in deliberate efforts to understand a language, like in a grammar class. On the contrary, acquisition refers to an unconscious process of understanding a language where we don't put in deliberate efforts to learn. For instance, we acquire our L1, but we learn in L2. Okay, coming back to the language learning theory, this theory explains language learning as it happens in the mind. The analogy which is used to describe the language learning process is of a computer. Like a computer receives input, processes the input and gives output. Likewise, the mind receives language, processes it and gives output. This theory focuses mainly on how the mind processes a language. It also deals with how a language is stored in our brain, how it is retrieved, and how we use that knowledge. They believe that language learning happens through exposure and experience of it. You will notice that there are several concepts in the video about what happens in the mind. So let's start off with the first one. Universal grammar. When these researchers studied what children were acquiring in language classes, despite the fact that teachers were teaching different topics, they found out that there is a similar pattern in which children were acquiring English. They called it natural developmental sequence. So they noticed that the children first acquired the progressive form, a verb like jumping, catching, flying, etc., then the concept of plural, and then copula, as in he is happy. After that, they picked up auxiliary, followed by basic articles. The interesting fact is that when we teachers teach regular and irregular past form of verb, we choose regular past to be taught first because it has pattern, which we think makes it easier for a learner to learn. However, it is opposite as per a child's mind. A child first acquires irregular past verbs and then regular past verb. So, having identified this natural developmental sequence, the researchers theorize that humans have an innate faculty for language learning, which is called LAD, or language acquisition device. So LAD is there in everyone's brain and it is activated when we receive language input. So when we receive input and our device is activated, it organizes grammar in the mind. Now let's have a look at how our mind organizes the language. Look at the dialogue in this picture, which is happening on the dining table between a mother and her son. The son goes, "I put my plates on the table." "You mean I put the plates on the table?" "No, I put them on by myself." Here you can see that despite the mother's correction of the verb, the child repeated the same form. This is due to the fact that child's brain is organizing the information. The child first learned the irregular past, so he must be using put correctly before learning the regular past forms of verb, which takes ed. So the child's mind organized the new information with the old one. Therefore, the child started adding ed even with the irregular past. This mixing keeps on happening when a child learns new language features. This mixed up language is known as interlanguage. Interlanguage is a child's second language before it reaches a reasonable level of proficiency. In this interlanguage, the language is organized, reorganized, structured, and restructured. Let's look at the concept of restructuring. This is basically the adjustment of what has been learned in the mind. For example, the learners have learned present simple tense and the past simple tense. Now the present perfect tense, which deals with both the tenses, needs to be restructured in the mind. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video and think about, can we expect learners to produce language almost correctly while they are in the learning process? Because in exams, we expect them to be 100% correct or they lose marks. So what do you think about it in the light of what goes on in the mind? I hope you all have thought about good 10 minutes or so and jotted down your thoughts on a piece of paper. Let's move on. Since we've been talking about language learning processes that go on in the mind, let's differentiate two types of knowledge at this stage: explicit and implicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is the knowledge which can be described to anyone. For example, good cause-effect relationship. If we've written an essay and we are to describe the cause-effect relationship in it, we can do so. On the contrary, if we are told to describe the difference between going to and will or shall, we may not be able to verbalize it because we have acquired it implicitly. So we can use it correctly but can't verbalize its rule. So this is referred to as implicit knowledge. Another type of knowledge that is described by the researchers is called procedural knowledge, which is the ability to use our implicit and explicit knowledge for communication. At this stage, I'd like you to pause and write down your ideas about this question. Does knowing about language improves learners' ability to use such knowledge? Of course not. Such knowledge needs to become procedural knowledge by practice. Now here is another pause for thought. Now let's think about learning a language without knowing its rules. Well, many first and second language users do so, making use of implicit knowledge, but focus on form is required to take the learners beyond a plateau they would reach only with explicit knowledge. Although we can make use of our implicit knowledge to learn a language, this knowledge needs to be noticed. Noticing refers to the belief that some aspects of language can be learned easily if learners notice them. So learners pick up forms from input when they notice them. This process is called uptake. So it's very important that learners should notice language forms to make these features part of their language repertoire. However, the process is very slow because learners can notice one form at a time and need a lot of practice as well as input for the same form to make it part of their implicit knowledge. Here is an example of language input which I used in my class to have my learners notice the past simple form. Here I've textually enhanced the language features which I wanted them to uptake. I didn't say anything to them, I just did a comprehension lesson using the text and let them uptake the form. Okay, so let's move on to the conclusion. So far, we have learned about the processes that happens in the mind when we learn a second language. So the first concept we looked at was universal grammar, which explains the natural developmental sequence and the language acquisition device in the mind. The second concept was interlanguage, which is the learner's language before it reaches reasonable level of proficiency. The third concept was about restructuring, which explained the adjustment of new knowledge with the old knowledge in the mind. Then we looked at implicit and explicit knowledge and concluded that many features can be learned implicitly if learners notice them in the input, and we also need explicit learning to go beyond the plateau which we can reach with implicit learning. I hope this gives you a fair idea about language learning as it happens in the mind. In the next video, we will look at the language learning as a skill-based learning. So see you in the next video. Bye.